Ladies and gentlemen, Madam, Ms. Frederique is the head of political section of the EU delegation in India since 1st of September. Before this, she has had vast experience of handling human rights issues in the European External Action Service in Brussels, as well as human rights in the Asia-Pacific region. Ma'am is from Frankfurt and a lawyer by training. She holds a Masters of Law degree from the University of London, and after having focused on public international law and international relations at the LSE, she has also been a member of the German Association at the United Nations. On being posted in New York from 2008 to 2012, ma'am contributed heavily to the building of EU's role in the United Nations following the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon, covering Asia and Europe on the Security Council team, as well as peacekeeping, human rights, and a rule of law. Ma'am, I expect and hope that this interaction proves to be a very fruitful one for all the delegates and the executive board members. And once again, we are very thankful to have you here. Can we please have a huge round of applause for ma'am? We also have amongst us our CEO, Mr. Ryan Pinto. Can we have a huge round of applause for sir as well? Ma'am, now I would request our Secretary General to felicitate you with a memento from our side. And a sapling as well. Can we also have felicitation of Sir, our CEO, Mr. Ryan Pinto? Can we have a huge round of applause for him as well?
Good morning, ma'am. I am Kshitij Bansal from India, and he is Satyavi from Mauritius. And we are going to moderate this discussion between you and our participants. So this discussion is going to be in a town hall format, where we have certain themes which we want that you should particularly address for our enthusiastic participants. So we are going to address those themes with you, and then we'll even open the discussion for our participants to engage in the discussion that we are having here.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for this overwhelmingly warm reception. I have to say I'm new in India, so I've been in country only 4 weeks, and this is my first encounter with students, actually my first semi-public outing, so I'm actually also quite excited about being here. But when we saw the conference program and what you're organizing, that you're both advocating the cause of the United Nations, but also the interaction with many other countries and regions that work and believe in the United Nations, we were immediately ready to appear in this conference. For sake of good order, I always have to say I make personal remarks to a large extent, but you will see I was able to distribute to you a very recent new brochure or new leaflet on our general lines on the UN, the EU-UN engagement. Let me also say quickly in advance, I hear from the moderators, they actually scared me with the scope of topics they want me to address. So you will see that the EU's engagement with the UN, and of course the work of the UN is so broad, it perhaps won't be able to address everything in detail. There is a lot of complexity, and we need to, if we want to understand some issues, we would have to delve very deeply, and we won't have the time this morning. But I'm of course ready to speak and entertain all questions that you have. As a short preface, let me say, and sorry, I have to bring in some complexity to this equation. You know that the EU is comprised of 28 member states, and we make up 500 million plus. The member states remain the members of the United Nations, while the European Union itself is accredited as an observer. However, by virtue of its coordinating the member states in virtually all negotiation processes, it after all represents that bloc, so to speak, of 28 member states in the intergovernmental forums of the UN and in all or most of all the important international negotiations. In addition, one should also not forget the interaction between the UN and the EU as a security actor, as a development provider, as a humanitarian provider, and as, of course, most recently, an international negotiator. And if you will, the relationship evolved over time, very, very much in line with the development of the European Union itself. So just as a quick commercial in the beginning, you know that the EU was founded or European Economic Community, to be very precise, was founded in the 1950s, largely as an economic project, creating a single market in order to both ensure prosperity in Europe and more or less equal living conditions also of all the European citizens in the member states. But it was, of course, as you will have discussed in the last days, a huge peace project. The concept was by and large that by integrating economies and also integrating the crucial coal and steel sector, crucial sectors for weapon production at the time, and by integrating the management of nuclear safety, the EU or the European continent would be brought to peace and would not be falling back to what was, of course, the horrors of the First and Second World War in the last century. So largely an economic integration project for many years. You will also remember that in the 1990s, when a bloody war, including genocide, struck in the European continent, we became much more aware of the need of having a solid political project as well, including a solid foreign and security policy. So you could say that while in the beginning the EU was economic actor, development partner, humanitarian partner for the UN largely until the mid-1990s, we ever since early 2000 started to become a serious crisis management actor by mounting, both by creating capabilities through pooling resources between the member states, also creating new forms of civilian crisis management operations and becoming more and more an important partner for the UN in that area, in the peace and security. In part, a complementary partner in regions where the UN wouldn't be able to mobilize assets, in part a partner who was quicker in mobilizing presences, so assuring in a number of crucial theaters of operation the bridging presences that the UN was requesting. And most recently, of course, you know the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007, in force since 2009, which rearranged the way we are represented internationally. Ever since, I think it's much more apparent that the EU is also an actor in the political realm. And for everyone, the Iran nuclear deal, where the EU played a prominent negotiation role, will sort of represent this coming to age of the EU also as a political actor. I just want to preface our discussion by these words so that we have situated us and our relationship. So I'm ready for your questions now.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So very rightly you addressed as to how the entire world views the European Union as a hub of integration. So my question is in respect of rising conservatism throughout the world. Like, since we have conservatist parties as a result of which we witnessed the Brexit as well, then we have conservatist parties like the Golden Dawn in Greece. You also have conservatist parties in Germany and France as well. So in view of that, how do you address the issue of sustaining the European Union over the coming years?
I think the analysis we bring to this, and of course we are not in the position to comment on any sort of the quality of any political movement, but in Europe we talk a lot about the rise of populism as well, and populism as a negative reaction to either real or perceived threats to livelihoods, jobs, the way of life. Yes, I think we're very seized with this problem. However, very often when you dig deeper and when you look at we have regular Europolls, we regular poll European public opinion. When you then unpack questions or you ask citizens if they think that Europe continues to play a role on certain issues, or that they want integrated solutions, that they want open solutions, very often at that stage you actually get the answers back that motivate us actually to continue working. On the general lines of European integration, including, I haven't said that in the beginning, I mean the project very much rests on democracy, human rights, rule of law, tolerance, living together, diversity as strength. You know, we have these slogans of diversity and unity, or unity and diversity, so trying to explain that the cultures, but also many people who come to us and live in Europe actually strengthen the identity and the let's say the fabric of society in Europe. They make active contributions. They make us more attractive rather than less attractive. But I'm not denying that at the moment we have a difficult streak of political discussion in Europe, and if you've referred to elections where they were successful. On the Brexit, I guess you have more questions for me. You know that we as civil servants cannot really comment on results, and of course there is full respect for the expression of the popular will in a key member state. So if you want to ask me more questions on the next steps and everything, I'm happy to entertain that. However, I think it's important to analyze also underlying reasons, and I think a lot has been done to understand who has voted how, and perhaps the answer to many of the grievances really lies in addressing all the features that we saw. We saw young against old, we saw the cities against the countryside, we saw certain strata of population voting in a certain way. My personal feeling is that it was sad not to have young people mobilized enough to basically reaffirm what they normally think when you poll them, also in the UK, that their future lies with Europe. So in a way, I think it came as a shock to many of the students. In the future, the lessons for us might be to go out like today and be more proactively, also trying to say this project is about us and we do it with passion, and about you because it's about your future. And the young people in the UK will have to, in the end also pay for what's going to happen. And that's it's perhaps difficult.
So our next question pertains to what you said, young people, and the South Asian continent is full of it.
Yeah.
And in some aspects, the political disruptancies that have been happening in Europe also happening in the South Asian aspect. And what would you say holds an integration project such as the EU from being transposed to this continent, to blocs such as the SRAC? And what holds them back from reaping the benefits that uniquely only Europe is able to do?
I mean, as I said, the foundations of Europe lay in the Second World War, and in the belief of key statesmen at the time, largely statesmen, of having to do historic steps of integration in order to never have this reproduce. I mean, most of the leaders, the political leaders who were negotiating the European unification were personally marked by what has happened, have been either, we have also had large refugee movements after the war, or they have involvement as young soldiers with warfare and have made traumatizing and difficult experiences. Some of the post-war leaders came from the resistance or were actually imprisoned and so on. So they had a very, very deep personal conviction to that. I really don't recommend or hope that another region needs to go through that in order to understand then the benefit of the counter project, so to speak. And that's, I think, what we always try to say when we try to learn from history, also learn from each other's history. What I think is quite absent overall in the broader Asian context is this will to unify the continent on the basis also of norms and principles. You will know that the EU actually was, or the European community again at the time in the 1950s, was a parallel project to the Council of Europe, where democracy, rule of law, human rights, institutions were advocated. So in a way they existed as twins. And so when we've been interacting in the last years with other regional groupings, trying to promote this model of regional integration, and the model really is that we think that strong regional organizations can be solid blocks or building blocks of global governance structures. And of course, I didn't want to bore you with theory at the beginning, but our overall approach to international affairs is, of course, a model of being rules-based, gradual creation and universalization of international law, developing habits of cooperation, institutionalizing those, first having them in permanent meetings, permanent conferences, later institutionalizing them. And the EU, so to speak, can be seen as an organization that went very far. We know that other regions perhaps don't want to go as far as developing methods that go beyond intergovernmental coordination. An organization I worked a lot with when it was in its reforming stage was the ASEAN countries, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which in the 2000s underwent the similar projection of a single market. Remember, they had a single market project for 2020, then brought it forward. And they were also grappling with this issue of whether they needed more political integration. And you saw then where they came out, they created their charter in Manila, and then later came also up with an ASEAN human rights declaration. It's less detailed, but it at least contains certain principles also for their political cooperation. So we would think, learning from our experience and from walking this with other partners, that you need a minimum at least of joint commitment to political principles and of course of principles of dealing with each other. Now, I think it's rather difficult to make comments to the SARC at the moment, given very recent development. But of course, we have attained a relationship with SARC. We've been interested also in observing SARC summits, and generally we are very much in favor of other regions creating stronger regional organizations.
Thank you. And broader question, would you say our world, which is in need of a deeper global cooperation these days, needs more of interstate interactions or more unions, more blocks?
I think actually everything. It's issue specific, and also again, it depends a little bit on the how like-minded you are and how much you can then go forward. You know, the way we interact in the EU is actually quite business-oriented. In a way, through the treaties that we have, we always say Treaty of Lisbon can nearly be considered of constitutional nature. It really sets out our general principles, everything we share, the joint commitments. So you don't actually renegotiate each time you meet anymore the basic assumptions or the basis hypothesis of cooperation. It is foreseen there. You also know we have created instruments and permanent meetings and structures. And then you discuss more on the substance of problems at hand, and you go into formulating policies, strategies, action plans, and then something else. In other relations, and all the relationships that we have with other countries or organizations, of course, you start on a more fundamental level in the reaffirmation of the principles, in representing one more time, you know, your own assumptions, but then of course you try to find like-mindedness and try to also say, okay, we are in this relationship, you know, we have joint declarations which then normally, or partnership agreements which normally then form the basis for much deeper, more technical or more in-depth exchanges on a number of issues. So I think there's a parallelity. I guess that's also for all the young people, the world is complex. It's nothing we can deny, and we need to often look at the most adequate solution to handling either a relationship or a substantive issue.
Hi, my name is Utkarsh and I work with Ryan International. Now my question comes to you on a personal level. You're a German and you know you've had this experience in diplomacy. So you can answer this question as a German who has an experience, because I think Indians have a lot of trust in Germans because most of us know German through their technology. You'll see a lot of Volkswagen and a lot of Mercedes in India. So we trust Germans. So my question comes to you on a personal level. The idea of European Union revolutionized the concept of humanity. You got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. I think when you put Germans together with Greeks and Swedish together with Italians, now it's like putting potatoes and you know, apples together. They're two extreme cultures, and the idea of it is so revolutionary that within 70 years, it's taken the continent of Europe ahead of human race. And we have it, the kind of development, equality, human rights. It's amazing, you know, and this is what children should learn. But now we have this rise of nationalism, you know, that is coming up. And I'm not talking in terms of Europe, but because you have come to India, it's your 4 weeks, in India, nationalism has become a big debate, okay? And as a German who realized the continent of Europe realized where nationalism took them 70 years ago. The results were World War I and World War II. You have realized, and now the continent of Europe leaves nationalism And because you realize what nationalism, as a German, I've never seen Germans shouting about Germany or raising their flags, because you realize where nationalism led that continent. How will you like to explain these young students of India the definition of nationalism and patriotism? And especially I have a lot of German friends, and I know we have a lot of discussions about it with them. Explain them that what is nationalism and how relevant is it in the 21st century? Does it have a place? And what is the difference between nationalism and patriotism for you as a German? Because they are the future. If we don't talk about to them right now, this rise of nationalism in our country, you know the results of it.
Yeah, difficult question in particular for a German. You know about the history. Actually, I think for us, advocating the idea of Europe and actually pointing more to what unites Europe, the common features of European civilization, but also of world civilization, because if I may say that, many of the larger, bigger and older civilization have inspired each other over the years, have learned from each other, have seen rise and fall also of bigger countries. I mean, your country is an enormously old civilization and has incredible traditions and interesting scriptures and philosophy and other features. I mean, for Germans, really the lessons from the Second World War, but also from First World War, obviously. I mean, the nation staged 2 major wars in Europe with an enormous bloodshed, and they had incredible consequences for the whole world. I think the consequence for us has always been, propelling ourselves in playing this role in integrating Europe, advocating, tolerance and also curiosity in everybody else, trying to, of course, learn about our own culture and history and language. And you will know that Germany calls itself the country of the poets and writers and also thinkers, and that's why, the slogan is very much a country of ideas for Germany. But however, not do it in a way that presupposes that you have all the solutions for others. So trying to develop your own culture further. I mean, get to know your own culture. You will also, of course, have that at home. Know about all the writers, the developments. In our case, musicians are very important. Music is an extremely important feature. To understand that better, projecting aggressively or in a way that presupposes or projects superiority. Because I think that was a big problem for coming from Germany, that then with the quality of achievements, a projection of being superior was naturally associated or projected. And of course there was this aggressive streak to it. So really that, by teaching history and also teaching more about other countries around us. I think we when I was growing up, we learned more about, the first universities, where were they? The 13th century, and one early one was in Poland, and another one was in Prague. Prague was, you could count it to the German-speaking influence, but then the oldest universities are both in the UK and in Italy. So I mean, all these countries are cultural nations. Some were unified earlier, others brought certain thoughts. I mean, you all know about the Magna Carta, so the UK can also claim an important role in developing liberal tradition and human rights and basic notions of due process and the rule of law. So I think that's something the education sector opened up very much in teaching also European history rather than just German history. And the other feature that was very marking my years of youth were numerous exchange programs. So most German cities, in my case Frankfurt, are twinned with cities in Europe. And really, the start was in the 50s with the UK, with France, and when I was doing my first travel to the UK, you would face prejudice. And oh my God, the Germans are here, we don't want them. But you start to talk to people, and they understand also how complex often your own family history is, for instance. And many Germans, and I know this about many Indians, they have all the experiences of what is the history, in our case, of Europe in the 20th century, of war, of being half orphan, being a refugee, being all of that, but still being able also to make it in the societies in which we live due to education and work and so on. So I think exchanges are very important at an early age. So we did them with UK, France, and then later, very difficult for us personally, Israel. Being a student, I was a student ambassador in Tel Aviv when I was, I think, 15 or 16. That was very, very difficult and to face a lot of negative reactions in the beginning. But again, talking to people, trying to explain how you suffer also under your own history can be quite powerful. So personal contacts, I guess, traveling, if you can. And also, I think the realization that you can be affirmative and confident without putting somebody else down. You can be that in your own, due to your own achievements, but not comparing yourself or having to basically belittle the achievement, the features of another human being. I think that's where I like to leave.
Thank you.
So we take the next question from Kilian from Germany.
Thanks. So, talking about this rise of nationalism, because it's not only happening in Europe, you can really see it worldwide. You know, when you look to the US, for example, one of the biggest economies, really present in the media. Would you say that nationalism is an unavoidable or necessary side product of the fast pace that globalization took? And do you think that's the reason why it might be temporary in its nature? And talking about globalization and further integration worldwide, there have been some small movements towards a UN parliamental institution. Do you think this European model of having a parliament as a political institution could work on the UN level? Do you think it would be a right instrument for further global integration without losing culture and individual culture worldwide?
The negative side effects of globalization, which should be addressed much more. But I think it's also important to distinguish between populism again and nationalism. And I think some of the answers which you can see now in the American campaign, if I may speak about something wide outside my real area of competence, but this issue of trying to bring it back again to the facts. What are the actual facts at hand? What is the projection or is a reduction of reality? Back to facts, back to who has done what, when, how, why, and also always turning around the questions against those who only talk negative. What would be your solution? You know, I try to integrate them. And in Germany, I know we have a new challenge at the moment in terms of a new party that rides on a nationalist, populist, both platform. But we've had other such movements over the past. And mostly the moment they got integrated or drawn in and had to show what they would do if they took political office, in many instances, the movement was already finished in the next election. So there, I also think we should take that in a, of course, very sensitive way, fine-tune policies, and perhaps be much more proactive about also communicating the advantages of globalization and EU, integration. I think probably in the UK context, if we had said more about what labor standards, what environmental standards, what overall, even judicial review came a lot with the EU and the Council of Europe, which forced the UK to have to also look at some features of sort of administrative tribunals and so on. So there are advantages also to all these integration projects. On globalization, I think it's a very long discussion. Who does it serve? Who is advocating what side of it? Is it rules-based enough? Of course, we've seen the reduction, the race to the bottom when it comes to taxation and work standards and so on. On the other hand, it also has enormous advantages. So a pure negative view of globalization, it's also a false projection. But again, we need more of the solutions that we would advocate, more norms, more perhaps legal redress, ways of also overcoming mixed work biographies and lack of social contributions. I know that actually India is discussing very interesting suggestions in that regard. And again, there, just contribute more with your ideas rather than just describing a problem and then talking it down. And this is sort of necessarily a feature, and we have to go back to the old solution, which I think is unrealistic given the intricate linkages or the integration, the level of integration that the economies and companies worldwide have reached. We need to address all these sort of negative features in a proactive manner. As regards the EU, really, I think the EU is not planning to export its own model of governance. We've been very open to sharing our experience, and when we had ASEAN colleagues visit Brussels in their charter drafting process, we would share the experience that over time the EU realized that it needed a political pillar, so to speak, in accompanying economic integration. And actually, I mean, we saw with the 4 freedoms, freedom of movement, freedom of goods, and so on, we also needed some accompanying legislation, for instance, on work standards. So sometimes we had the integration first, and then we saw what we had to put in place. So that we shared without being prescriptive on the models others choose. But it can be, let's say, widening or putting governance on also a multinational level might just be the commensurate answer to the integration of economies. But it could also be that you do that for certain areas, but you keep, of course, your national solutions or the national governance on other areas. And I have to learn much more about India, but you have a quite complex union and federal system, and you already have, in part, perhaps not enough actually joint solutions, but in part you might have found a model of being, governing at the state level versus governing at the union level. And that's, by the way, something the EU always tries to balance out. We call it the principle of subsidiarity. So if an issue is better addressed on the national level, it stays there, but if it needs a unified solution, it should go there. And for me, the model is rather that we have regions that integrate and then, convene at the UN and also compare notes on mostly regulatory solution where we could benefit perhaps from a global model.
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you for visiting us, though. My question is that we all know that the Treaty of Westphalia was the one from where the idea of sovereignty and the celebration of nationalism began. And that treaty was basically relegated to the back after the 2 world wars. Are you worried that as this generation, which was directly affected by the 2 world wars, begins to fade away, and as collective amnesia begins to start up, there is going to be a resurgence in that sort of a nationalism which was jingoistic, and hence a breakup of this globalization process that we started in the 1950s?
We have a big discussion in Europe of what happens now that all the direct witnesses, indeed, of both war, but also of the Holocaust, for instance, are actually, sort of in their last years or dying. That's why I have a little bit the same answer as to the earlier question. We might now perhaps have to make explicit and explain much more why integrated solutions, or in our case, for instance, freedom of movement in the EU, freedom of students to study everywhere where they want. We can settle, we can study, we can live everywhere where we want, and we also have now advantages of the euro having much easier interaction between economies. So I just think, again, we might have to make a bigger explanatory effort to why we brought about these solutions, and also what the benefits are, because many people tend to take everything they enjoy now, including this the freedoms, for granted, and then only put their energy in criticizing the negative aspects or the remaining challenges. In part, of course, also confusing who is responsible for what, or having overall issues with where their life goes. I think you all know that this generation, or also the younger generation, faces a life with many uncertainties and in part very fast developments. But then the reaction to say no to everything, is particular to say no to further communication and unification and joint solution, is perhaps just not an adequate response either.
Right. So, ma'am, I'd like to now take your attention to our second theme for the day, which is discussing the issue of refugees and their integration into the European society. Because Europe as a society is very distinct from the other societies we have throughout the globe. And moreover, in this regard, I'd like you also to address the question about the creation of a European Union standing army, because that is something that's been really on the table for the past few years. And recently, the European Union chief also addressed how the process has to be sped up. And how do you view the role of the standing army in light of NATO in the region? And also in view of Frontex, which is like not being able to give the desired results in view of the refugee crisis?
I'm not here to criticize the question, but I don't necessarily like the confounding of the refugee migration issue with the sort of the EU army issue, because I think they both merit separate solutions. So on the defense, an ever closer, perhaps defense union. Just a few facts. I can't predict where this discussion is going. You know that there was a very early attempt of, also in order to solidify peace in Europe, to create a European defense policy already in the 50s. It was originally part of the overall original project for a European community, and it failed and then was only picked up in much reduced form as the project of creating more security and defense structures since the 1990s that we're discussing. And what we do currently is the member states retain all their military assets and capabilities, but make them available to joint missions, operations. We call them crisis management operations. They have some standing capability on alert, which can be dispatched quickly, readily, and also there is much more discussion on integrating defense sector into the European Defense Agency, because what has been seen, or what has been sort of understood over time is that the way the European defense systems are organized, as far as, even when it comes to production of weaponry and so on, it's not very effective through the smaller scale thing, and so there could be actually advantages in integrating purchasing or technological developments. But where the political discussion goes, and at this moment, it's really, really hard to predict. The refugee situation, I think, merits a longer discussion. So it's intertwined, and we have to be a bit, again, precise in looking at migration flows to Europe, where you still have no common concept between the EU member states on how open they are for accepting, regular migration, and the overall acceptance of refugees, which generally is, of course, governed by international refugee law, and which has been a feature for many, many, many years. There's been up and downs. And if you look at the case of just Germany, we had major flows in the end of the 80s, and we had sort of changes in some of the implementing legislation. We're just facing now, of course, a major movement. However, we have a big discussion between politicians within Europe, but also in the individual member states, on how to manage the problem while, of course, also being aware of the worldwide trend. I mean, if you look at 60 million refugees and IDPs, perhaps 65 at the moment, many of them taken in by a neighboring country, the EU, of course, support a lot of what the neighboring countries make available, humanitarian and other assistance. So the EU, I think, is trying to do its part, both there and taking refugees to Europe, while, of course, looking at brokering solutions, if possible, to some of the major crisis situations that basically trigger the major refugee flow. To me, the whole integration and of people of, let's say, foreign origin and working against xenophobia, discrimination, and so on, once they've arrived, is still a little bit different. It's been a long-term task, and I think we've done quite a lot, although at the moment, given the numbers, which in part are unusual for some countries, there are increasing problems. So I think also there communication has to be upscaled, more civil society or overall civic engagement is necessary. And me personally, I always think we need to come back to very basic features also of human rights education. You know, if you've thought now for the last 20 years, everything is to be taken for granted and so on, we have to perhaps come back to really basic messages. It's common humanity, everybody has basic human rights, we are equal, you know, race doesn't matter. Very, very simple norm reaffirmation, I think we would call it. So for me, like, more could be done, speaking with my old human rights hat on communicating very basic human rights messages, because it gets a bit lost. But also, I think, again, you have to look a bit at what is covered by media. You know, or those who looked a bit more at media often also likes to cover the difficult or the negative story. If you then look into the, let's say, the overall experience of receiving refugees in Germany, you still have a broad array of a lot of, you know, people who take refugees in, who tutor children, who make sure that language skills are acquired so that refugees can work or follow training. It's quite impressive what has been developed also as sort of civic, pure personal initiatives. You have mentoring programs, twinning of families. That also should be covered perhaps a bit more, because it's also beautiful stories of human encounter.
Yeah, pertaining to this, we move again into xenophobia and integration, but the other aspect of it. Human rights are a cornerstone of humanity, and the problem we face with xenophobia and integration can be virtually found everywhere in the world. But let's focus on EU and India. India is as diverse of a place as the EU is in many aspects, and as you mentioned, public sensitization and simple messages play a big role. But could you tell us a little bit more about the key actors or infrastructures that should be put in place in a country like India, for example, which is a developing state compared to Europe, to be able to uphold the values of human rights and again move on to cultural integration of, for instance, let's say the refugees?
Quite new here, so perhaps I could learn from you. What I understand is that in terms of human rights commissions, for instance, you actually have quite a good coverage. You have a national commission and state, and sometimes even regional district or other commissions. Probably there again, I have not reviewed statistics or funding. Also, probably they can step their work up as we all could. But again, one of my basic messages is also sort of learning from each other. The German Institute for Human Rights has only recently been sort of fully acknowledged as fully independent. So I think the National Commission in India is actually working along the international standards, but might be willing to pick that up. I know there's a UN information office in this country. Again, I've only for the first time encountered or heard about their work on International Peace Day on the 21st of September. Again, that would be actors with whom we would be liaising. We support as EU many human rights organization, grassroots, civil society actor who try to also do a lot of public awareness raising, sensitization, use of media, in a mixture of using, as I say, media, producing leaflets, giving basic education, but also sometimes doing a bit of, public performances also in the street. It's not exactly the topic you were asking me about, but next week and the week thereafter, a lot of attention will be given to children, to girls, because we'll be celebrating International Day of the Girl Child. You'll see a lot of mobilization around this issue, into all directions. But educate girls, improve leadership skills of girls, just make it a normal feature that girls can basically thrive for each and every job, and so on. So that's things where we actually cooperate with a lot of both civil society actor and other partners in India. But probably, really, I'm too new to say whether this area of work is covered enough. But I'd be happy to explore and invest in that.
Right. So, ma'am, my last question is more about your experience as an officer of the European Union and as to how your experience has been in India thus far, since you've been here only for 4 weeks. How do you like the people here? How has your experience been thus far? If you could share some anecdotes from your personal experience.
Well, vibrant, puzzling, impressive, amazing. I've been positively surprised, I have to say. Young country, very, very interesting, very, very dynamic people with a lot of curiosity. I've met many want to really get to know. So that's why I think there is actually a lot of potential and openness to learn about each other and interact more. But it's of course huge contradictions. I've seen also a lot of positive development compared to my student travel days here. I was once a backpacker on a very low budget in India, Rajasthan, and a bit further. So compared to this, amazing progress has been made. But then I guess what has been analyzed a lot in the context of India, really prioritizing also in the last year the attainment of international development goals, the component of equal sharing of the benefits of prosperity remains a big subject. And some of the basic problems which I know the government is addressing will really have to be prioritized forcefully. Because you know, in this whole debate about new sustainable development goals, the SDGs, Agenda 2030, if relevant, significant worldwide progress can be recorded, it is a lot will have to be found and done by India. But I think we're also all ready to share that journey and support you in it.
Thank you very much. And a last closing question or more, a way to look for a statement from you. Given that we are trying to reproduce a diplomatic platform here and the theme of the conference is Tomorrowland, would you be able to tell us how you personally or as a representative of the EU institution see EU-India relations in 10 years from now?
First of all, perhaps share with an anecdote first. I taught a longer seminar to a university student, PhD students, a couple years ago on EU foreign policy. And in the end, they had to make a summary. They should have done a presentation to the other fellow students, but they chose to make a sketch and projected the EU into, I think, 2020. When actually the US, I think, was calling our high representative for help to solve an international crisis situation. And we had basically all necessary, it was a mixture of, I think, an environmental crisis probably. So we had all the necessary crisis measures, assistance, I think it was fighting forest fires or so. We had all of the material at our disposal. We had one person to call, so it was clear who was representing and had action for Europe. So that was a vision where I think my students were even more more optimistic than I was. On EU-India relations, again, I'm discovering it only. I do believe on what we say in the official, in all our official speeches. We have more common vision, commonality, then we basically live, so to speak, in our interactions day by day. We would both benefit, and perhaps the world could benefit from us working more together and being more also outward looking. So that's something I want to be working on. I think in part we need to stay business oriented, obviously, but more regular consultations and then agreement on joint action would be very welcome, and we are absolutely ready to facilitate and to work hard to make it happen.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, sir. Sir, ma'am, I would like to ask a question. Ma'am, does the European Union's advice to the crisis-hit countries means affect the growth in the economic field or in the political field? Ma'am, does the European Union's advice to the crisis hit countries affect the economic or the political growth? I would like to ask.
You mean the EU member states themselves?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think you cannot disconnect it because definitely some of the political reactions were connected to economic measures, but that's why also the discussions are extremely complex and weigh these factors in. And I think generally the solution in European discussions is to help countries to stay on board and to stay on, say, reasonable policies. That's why that's a lot of also leniency and help afforded, and quite some generosity in the way economic questions are treated.
Thank you very much. We'd like to invite the CEO of Ryan International to say a few words.
Well, firstly, I want to thank God Almighty for this day, and also for you to just take out your time to be with us. I know that we didn't make it a very easy morning for you, but hopefully that's a positive thing so that it gives some insight into the maturity, the level of thinking of our students who are participating here today. If I could take away, I was taking down a couple of notes. And if I could take away about 4 points from what you said, and this is just a bit of summary for some of you. One is the world is very complex, and it has complex issues. We try to resolve them, but they don't have, at times, and many a times, a simple solution. So it takes time, it takes a lot of negotiation, it takes a lot of teamwork, it takes a lot of compromise as well to come up with that solution. When you think something is good, is it really good for everybody? Or is it just good for the majority? There was a talk about integration. One would say that integration is great because you're adding value, because you're learning a lot more. Could be a flip side where somebody might say integration leads to dilution because you're losing yourself amongst the crowd. You're losing your values or losing your point of view or losing how you used to do things because you're doing things differently because you're learning from somebody else. This is something which was very significant, and I really would like to convey the importance of this message. You said that in order for you to succeed, or for you to be, in simpler terms, you don't have to put somebody down. You don't have to negate or, you don't have to put somebody down. You don't have to destroy their argument. You don't have to ridicule their perspective. You just have to put your point across. And if I could take it one step further, one could deduce that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to put your point across. As long as your content is strong, as long as what you're saying is valid and it has some impact, you don't have to be the loud, aggressive, mean person to get your point across. And one of the things that you said is how the EU all came together, and the significant role of education and the significant role of the exchange programs, which you in your youth were part of. And this is what, or at least this is one of the things that the Model United Nations that we run is exhibiting. Because here we have a representation of our schools from India, but also abroad. And so there are children here and there are students here from various parts of the country. Some of you have not even visited those particular cities. Some of you have traveled more abroad than you would have done domestically. Because when we think about globalization, we think abroad. We don't think neighboring town or a neighboring city or another state within our own country. And at that time, maybe we forget what's actually maybe more important or critical to issues at home. But at the same time, we have our various exchange programs that are going global, and there are a lot of students here, and it gives me great joy to say that one of, I would say, our strongest exchange program partners is Germany. And so on that note, last but not the least, I would say Germany, ich liebe dich. We love you, Germany, and we really appreciate
I would like to thank everyone, the organizers, the participants, the challenging questions, and also say there's also Erasmus Mundus and the whole European, there's the Action in Education Fair, where we're just participating at that International Habitat Center, where opportunities also at European universities are presented today. So please discover Europe and work on the Europe or EU-India friendship.
Can we please have a huge round of applause?